Okay. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Q&A session for our first day of plenary speakers. Today we have Dr. Chris Marinangeli, who's with us, and he's going to be answering questions related to his presentation. We're having a little bit of connectivity issues with Dr. Rosell, but we hope to resolve those soon to allow her to participate in the Q&A. I invite you to post your questions within the chat feature so that we can, so you can certainly pose your questions to Chris, and we can progress on. But perhaps to get the ball rolling, Chris, great presentation. I want to thank you on behalf of the committee for your excellent presentation. And we look forward to exploring a little bit more about the work that you have been doing. I was really intrigued, and certainly we worked together on a couple of these components that you presented on today. But certainly, I think hopefully what the audience took away from your presentation was the fact that how Canadians are consuming plant protein is really less than ideal. I wonder if you could just explore that a little bit further. Like, what do you think how we should be addressing this issue? Is it a question of, is there a role for education? Is there a role for the industry in formulating new foods? Perhaps you could just explore that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think across the board, when we talk about, you've heard it for years, we talk about nutrition. I think there's certainly a nutrition gap with respect to education and nutrition literacy. I think that's something that probably needs to be brought a little bit more to the forefront with initiatives, especially with the latest iteration of Canada's Food Guide, which was quite a departure from previous iterations, even the way it was structured. There probably needs to be some core education that needs to occur. On the formulation side, I think that complementarity piece could be brought a little bit more to the forefront on the innovation side. But I even say from the education perspective, even if it was a tiered approach with respect to looking at, say, our regulatory frameworks around claims, we know even from the latest iteration of Canada's Food Guide to previous iterations of Canada's Food Guide, legumes have been talked about as a protein, a source of protein in Canadian diets, but we still can't claim them to be sources of protein on the shelf when you're walking down the grocery store aisle looking at a can of beans or a bag of lentils, for example. That could also be a place to start to get the ball rolling, just looking for that alignment with Canada's Food Guide on the grocery store shelves with those core foods that have been identified broadly as being a source of protein from a historical perspective. I think there could be some opportunities on the innovation side, also touching on the regulatory side, perhaps look at what we have for simulated meat, perhaps opening up the door for, say, fortification with amino acids, for example. But I also think when we look at the, what Canadians are eating with respect to plant protein, there really is a focus on one food group. We really have to bring some depth into the protein offerings, into what Canadians are consuming. And again, that's going to touch on a whole host of things, from regulations to education to innovation.
Okay. No, that's a great answer. I think it leads into a question that we have from one of our participants, and because you talked about protein complementation, and I think that plays into this question here. So what do you see happening in the future to improve protein content and quality in plant-based, let's put them in quotation, milks?
That's a tough, well, yeah, in Canada, you can't call them milks. I think that complementation piece is playing out a little bit in the dairy beverage space in Canada for that coveted protein claim. So we are seeing a little bit more complementation with the cashew dairy beverages, where it's actually could be almond, cashew, and pea. I think it's I don't know how it's going to play out, but that protein claim is coveted. I know industry's asking for it. I think we are going to see a little bit more complementation, but it's hard to say. There are limited tools available to us right now. I think one of the larger challenges is in the United States with the ability to call these foods milks. I will say in Canada, though, we do see some movement. So, even if you're not talking about protein and you're talking about micronutrients. Plant-based dairy alternatives in Canada are one of the few foods that we can fortify with, and recognition that this space is actually growing in Canada. We do see the regulations on the plant-based dairy alternative side moving with changes to regulations in the dairy milk side. So a good example of that is recently Canada increased the level of fortification of vitamin D permitted in dairy milk. Well, they released a statement a few weeks ago actually saying that the policy on the IMA for dairy alternatives, they're going to allow dairy alternatives to match the vitamin D fortification piece. So there is recognition of this. I think just, the tools available and the avenue to get there, it's a little bit slow.
Great, and I think the vitamin D opens up another question surrounding the nutrient density and the nutrient quality of how Canadians are consuming plant-based proteins based on that analysis. I wondered if you could comment on that. Those that are at the sort of that higher quartile of plant protein intake, are they at risk for being inadequate in key nutrients like vitamin D, for example?
Yeah, so yeah, the challenges that you'd expect from, say, chapter 1 of your Nutrition 101, textbook, you do see manifest out as you track to what Canadians are eating in that analysis on any given day. So for example, vitamin D intakes were lower, vitamin B12 intakes were significantly lower. And I should note that these comparisons were not from comparing quartile 4 to quartile 1. They're actually comparing quartile 4 to quartile 2, because that's where the majority of Canadians were consuming these foods. What was interesting was as well, though, in that highest intake of plant protein, iron intakes were the highest. And that's because of the fortification strategy around cereals that we have in Canada around iron fortification. So that sort of gives some sort of evidence that that fortification story actually does work. And it could be something that is explored from, I think it's going to be multiple tactics in terms of getting that protein piece fleshed out in a way that benefits Canadians on the nutritional side of things.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I encourage folks to continue to add your questions to the chat box if you've got questions for Chris. I believe we have connectivity with Dr. Rosell now. Dr. Rosell, would you like to say hi to the group just to confirm your microphone?
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
It's working.
Okay, so. Fantastic. Well, thank you and welcome. I know you're a few time zones away, and thank you for joining us today for this live Q&A. Really enjoyed your presentation. I think it highlighted a body of work over the last 20 years when it started off as sort of a niche development, and as you explained, it sort of rapidly increased to I watched this really interesting episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live where he asked people what is gluten, and a lot of people didn't know what gluten was, but they're gluten-free, but they eat gluten-free. So I think it's interesting to show that market segment has increased. And over that 20 years, what have you seen as sort of the biggest challenge for gluten-free food applications? You presented a lot of work on the bakery aspect. What has been the biggest challenge that your team has been working on?
I think when we started to work with gluten-free, the main challenge was to obtain gluten-free bread. That was the main challenge because it was it was really difficult to replace gluten and to have something that could mimetic the properties of the gluten. So that was the main challenge. And when we get it using hydrocolloids mainly, we realized that, okay, we could make bread because before it was not possible to make bread. But then when we analyzed how were the breads that we have in the market in different places, we realized that the nutritional quality and the nutritional labels of those breads were completely different than the gluten bread, the wheat bread. So that made us to really think about, because at that time we have a food pyramid and all the recommendations were following that food pyramid. But and in the food pyramid you have a bread and cereals-based product. But the bread for the gluten-free bread was completely different, with completely different nutrients profile than gluten bread. So it was something very important to consider, because we were giving the celiac patients, we were giving mainly fats and with low protein in those products. So at that point, we said, okay, we need to change the strategy, and we need to work with the nutritional quality of these products and try to increase the fiber content and also the protein content, and work with more dense commodities, and because of that we moved to legumes as protein sources.
Well, that sort of leads into the next question that we have from one of our audience members, asking more about some of the regulatory interests in novel plant proteins and allergenicity. And certainly with gluten-free applications, when gluten has such wonderful viscoelastic properties, and you have to use a lot of tricks in the toolkit to mimic that. That includes the use of products that are typically labeled as allergens. So we've got egg protein, there's whey or the milk protein. Have you recognized that as a challenge? And I see you're using things like transglutaminase and modification of proteins to try to mimic those viscoelastic properties. Is allergenicity in general a major concern for the gluten-free market?
Yes, of course, and mainly to those persons that are consuming gluten-free products, because it's the only treatment that they have for their own pathologies, and not for the rest of the consumers that they decide to consume gluten-free products without having any disease. But for those with disease, yes, because usually celiac disease or any gluten allergies, usually they are accompanying with something else, like allergies to the other allergens. So for instance, lactose or any other allergen. So we try to avoid those. And from the technological point of view, that represents also a challenge, because in the case of bread, for instance, we can avoid animal based proteins, but when we work in bakery, like working with muffins or any that type of products, in those cases, egg is working much better than plant proteins. But we have some also, we developed some tools to work in that.
Great, thanks. And maybe I could switch gears a little bit, Chris, but follow along on the regulatory side. Certainly, you're looking at concern around labeling on food products for protein content claims, but there's also other regulatory issues about sort of introduction of novel plant proteins, which could be a direction that the industry goes. For example, looking at gene editing to increase the protein quality of our agronomic crops. I think that's an area. I'm wondering if you could just sort of speak to sort of what do you see beyond the protein content claim issue as some of the regulatory hurdles for the plant sector moving forward, or the protein sector moving forward. Not just plants, it also impacts animal proteins as well, because the same issue around gene editing is pertinent to all protein sources.
Yeah, so with the new technologies coming online, it's presenting a lot of questions. I know our regulators are working through it right now, and there is some pressure there across the board. And then I think the other piece you have to consider is consumer acceptance as a value proposition at the end of the line. So where's the transparency piece land in terms of letting the consumer know, and is the consumer going to steer towards your product or steer away from it if they find out that some of these technologies have been applied? And that's just something to consider. With the novel proteins coming online, asking the question first and foremost, in Canada, is it a novel food? Can change the trajectory of a business plan, because if it is a novel food, moving through that regulatory process will require data and analysis, and usually years of review with the regulator. And I think the other challenge is the lack of harmonization in this area across jurisdictions. So in the United States, for example, it's GRAS status. In Europe, it's seeking scientific opinion from EFSA. And I think that does bring some uncertainty to the sector in general. But again, these concerns are highlighted on an ongoing basis. And I think there are initiatives underway looking at some strategies and tactics to, I don't want to say just to streamline things, but it certainly is something that I'd say the industry needs to be aware of and cognizant of as they're reviewing and updating their innovation pipelines.
Great. Thanks, Chris. We have some very specific questions. Cristina, there was a question about what type of egg albumin was used for viscoelastic properties and whey protein. I'm not sure if you can speak to the specifics there.
Oh, it was a long time ago when we tried to use those, but I put some QR so the people can go directly to the source where all the details about the albumin and whey proteins we use. About whey proteins, we use several ones because some of them were from different suppliers, some of them were hydrolyzed, some others were not, and we saw that the effect was different. So always it's dependent on the type of proteins or at least the process should be optimized depending on the protein that we are using.
So if you're looking at it from a Canadian context, where do you see the major opportunities for in gluten-free applications to sort of enhance the utilization of sort of Western Canadian crops, for example? There was a question about perhaps the use of canola, I know that flax is being used as a sort of the mucigens in flax are now being used as sort of an egg replacer in certain gluten-free applications. Where do you see opportunities? I know you've only been here for a few months, but perhaps that perspective could be brought to bear.
Yes, I think there is, first of all, I saw that the trends are the same that we have in Europe and in the rest of the world, that there is a lot of interest for gluten-free in general population, so for all the consumers, not only for people with pathologies. And here you have plenty of pulses and many varieties, also different possibilities for protein isolates. So I think there is a lot of room for research working with those isolates from the different pulses, because usually we have been working with flour from pulses and not really for at least in the case of soybean, we have been using protein isolates, but not in the other, other pulses. So I think it is a lot of different possibilities for applying those type of proteins, and not only from the nutritional point of view, that is really important, but also looking for the technological properties of those proteins.
Great, thank you. And so go ahead, Chris.
I would just add to that, individuals aiming to innovate in the gluten-free space in Canada, I would encourage them. There are some, I think, regulations in place to allow individuals to formulate and innovate in that space, realizing there could be some nutritional challenges. So there are some fortification tools available to the gluten-free innovation space that are not available to I think the core market. Just realization that there are some challenges in that area for those individuals.
Oh, that's a great point. And just a reminder for our audience that these presentations will be made available after the symposium has concluded for approximately 30 days, and there'll be an email sent out to that effect. And as Dr. Rosell mentioned, she has put QR codes on the bottom of her presentation, so you can click on those for pertinent references. And Chris has also included pertinent references in his presentation as well for further information. We're getting down to the end. We've only got about a minute left. Perhaps I could use this as an opportunity to ask our speakers, if you wanted to leave our audience today with one key message from your presentation, what would it be? Perhaps, Chris, I can start with you.
Sure. I would say that I think the plant protein space, especially in Canada, it's a great opportunity. I would encourage those innovating in the space to be cognizant of the nutritional profile of the foods being brought together, and not forget about protein quality. If we want elevation of the space across the board, we want increased recognition and perhaps some changes in regulatory frameworks to make things a little bit more permissible. We are going to need to see a lack of risk with respect to how these foods are going to affect Canadians once they're integrated. So I would just keep protein quality and nutrient density on the radar.
Great, thank you. And Cristina, perhaps you could share your final thoughts or your key messages for today.
Okay, my message is in line of Chris' message, that I think there is much opportunity for the proteins, but in my case, I'm going to focus on the technological point of view from the protein. So I think we have great opportunities because we have many different sources of protein. So we can innovate considering the functional properties of those proteins. So yes. It's a good time for them.
Great. Well, I'd encourage our folks to reach out to our speakers during the networking sessions if they're available, or to follow up with emails after the fact. We're getting to the end of our session here because we're going to transition to the networking session. So just as a bit of a wrap up, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Marinangeli and Dr. Rosell for their excellent presentations, and for being available to answer questions coming from our audience and to explore a little bit more about the topics. So thank you very much on behalf of the organizing committee and our audience today for your excellent work. Just as a reminder to our audience, we're going to be going into a networking session. You can click on the networking feature on the left-hand side of the Feed Loop tab, and you can basically connect and make appointments with various individuals that are part of the symposium. So I'd encourage you to do that. And with that, I wish you all the best, and the next sessions will be starting momentarily. Thank you.